Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and today I'm excited about what we're going to be discussing. We're going to talk about a well-known scholar, an Oxford-published scholar who is one of the top three voices today on the resurrection of Jesus. And yet, despite being kind of a second guesser and describing himself that way, he thinks that cautiously, perhaps he has experienced a miraculous healing. And so we're going to talk about that. Mike's a very measured guy. So that'll be Mike Licona, who's been on the show before. And pairing with Mike, we're going to have today Caleb Jackson, who's a personal friend and who has done a lot of work on miracles, including miraculous healings. And so today I'm very excited to welcome both of you guys to the show. Welcome, Mike, first. Glad to have you back.
Thanks, Braxton. It's always a pleasure, brother.
Yeah, we're excited to hear about this. And Caleb, glad to have you here. Caleb's got a book also that may be coming out on this in the coming days on miracles and things like that. He's debated John Loftus, a well-known new atheist in that tradition. And so we're excited
to have me on, Brad.
Yeah, great. Glad to have you both guys here. And let's go ahead and just talk a little bit about Mike for a second. Mike, I've always known you to be the type of guy who is very cautious, is a second guesser. I think that's why a lot of people have been attracted to you when it comes to the resurrection and the evidences for the gospels and things like that, and what you do with the gospels and all those things, is because they know that, okay, this guy is a believing Christian, but he's made a deep investment in making sure that he's being cautious and careful and conservative about what counts and what doesn't and all those kinds of things. So to hear you say that maybe you experienced something supernatural here recently makes my ears perk up more than maybe it would if it were some people I know. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about what happened?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So I used to be into martial arts years ago, and you do kicks, you use your knees a lot. And one has always bothered me a little bit because I hyperextended it back in college at the beginning of my training, my right knee. And over the years, it occasionally gives me problems. A few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, my knees really started to hurt. And I saw a physician on it. He gave me some exercises to do. That helped a little bit. And then I saw a video with a guy named Ben Patrick, and he was talking about his little book called Knee Ability Zero. And so I looked it up on Amazon and had fantastic reviews. A number of physical therapists were recommending it. So I bought the book, started doing exercises, did them for close to 2 years, and my knees were feeling 20 years younger. I mean, it was just great until they weren't feeling good anymore. The one wasn't feeling good. My right knee was acting up, and about 5 or 6 months ago, I was getting quite limited in what I could do with that. The one exercise, I forgot what it's called, but it allows you to be able to do what's called an Asian squat. And you'll see little, kids do it, maybe they're a year old and they stoop down, feet are flat on the floor, but they are all the way stooped down. And you'll see Asians doing this as well. They could be eaten and they're just stooping down like that. That's the way they sit in some countries. And you have to have real flexible hips and ankles to be able to do it. Well, I was able to do it easily and hold that position for a while, several minutes. And then the knee was hurting. I couldn't do it anymore. And it was really bothering me because it was fun to be able to do this kind of stuff. And my knees were feeling great. So our board met nearly 2 weeks ago. The board of our ministry, we meet a few times a year. And we have this one board member named Lisa, and God has given her the gift of healing, it seems. She's told us stories about being in other countries and down preaching the gospel there and healing. I mean, like healing broken legs by just praying over them. And the stuff isn't really, it's not unique to her. You hear stories like this all the time. Francis Chan healing deaf or blind kids, and things like this, Craig Keener and Lee Strobel telling stories. So, she 2 years ago, she prayed. Two of our board members were having some health issues. She prayed over them. One was healed, it seems, completely of something he had struggled with for years, and the other like half healed. So I said to her, this was Friday 2 weeks ago. We had dinner. All of us had dinner together, and then we went back to the hotel where everyone was staying, and we're just hanging out, talking, and having fun, being with one another. And I said, Lisa, I don't have like a broken leg or anything, but my right knee's been really bothering me. And I told her the story, and she said, well, would you let me pray for it? I said, sure. So she spoke in tongues for a few seconds, and then she put her hand on my knee and prayed for 30 seconds to a minute, it seemed like. And then she was done and just nonchalantly said, well, okay, try that. And, I thought when she was praying, if something's going to happen, maybe I'm going to feel something in my knee, like something warm or something moving around in there. I didn't feel a thing. But I got up and I figured, I don't know, I guess I'll try to do an Asian squat. And I popped right down into one. I could not, it's like, whoa. So I was there with, at that point, with two other board members. One's a physician and the other is an engineer. The two guys one had a full healing, the other had a partial healing. And, we're just looking at it. It's like, wow. And she said, well, how's it feel? I said, well, feels pretty good, but I still have some pain. And she says, well, let's do it again. So she put her hand on my knee, prayed in tongues for a moment and 30 seconds to a minute. And then she says, try that. And okay, popped right down again. She said, how's that feel? I said, it feels better. And she said, well, let's you still have some pain? I said, yep. She said, let's try it again. Well, we tried it 2 more times. There was no more improvement. My one board member, who was a physician, said, so Mike, I'm just curious, well, what's your pain level right now? And I said, maybe a 2. And he said, what was it before she prayed for you? I said, I would not have been able to do this, period. He said, but give it some kind of number. I said, I don't know, 8. He said, that's remarkable. And so, it's like, wow, I just felt it there. I thought, that's pretty neat. Nothing like this has happened to me before.
Were you like, when you before this, when you did the Asian or attempted the Asian squat, what could you have even done it at all? Was it like piercing pain?
It would have been piercing pain. Yes. I had it x-rayed and they said, the knee doctor said I had a large bone spur on it. Who knows? Maybe it resulted from that hyperextension back in college, but I don't know. But it was said really there was nothing he could do, and I just would have to limit what I could do. How much I bent it. So I'm riding on my way back home alone that night, and I'm just praying. I'm thanking God. And I'm thinking, did this really happen? What's it going to be like when I get home? What's it going to be like in the morning? Is this going to go away? I don't know. Why is it that all the pain didn't go away? Why just most of it? I don't know. I can't answer those questions. I do know when I got home, I was able to do it. The next morning, I was able to do it. And right before we went on right now, I just, while we were waiting during that 2-minute break, I tried it and was like, yep, popped right down into it. Probably still at a 2 in terms of some pain level. So it's like, that's pretty cool. So I praise God for it. I don't know whether it's going to go back to normal. I'll just throw one other thing. The next day at our board meeting, she prayed for it again. There was no improvement. I told her, hey, I got some neck arthritis too. And what happens is there's this arthritis in my neck, and the neck sometimes will just get locked up, the bone, and a chiropractor can fix it pretty easily. But when it gets locked up, the facet capsule will fill with liquid, and so I get a bump here. And so she prayed, came over, put her hand on it, prayed in tongues again for a moment, then prayed for a moment. And when I felt it, it's like that thing had gone down more than 50%. That kind of blew my mind. And she prayed again and went down a little further, and she prayed again, nothing different. I would say the lump isn't, it's still like what it was almost 2 weeks ago. Jury is out with that. I don't know what's going on there, but that's my experience.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mike, I want to get your impression in a minute, Caleb, on this, but I'll tell you that when I heard you tell that the first time, what I appreciated about it, as I said, is that number one, you were trying to be really careful about it, that, hey, there is still pain. It's just a 2 instead of an 8. And with the thing on your neck, yeah, that seems to be something that's still ongoing to some degree. But this is the sort of type of thing that, like, to people outside and some of the people on Twitter, when I posted about this and about your experience, like, oh, okay, so it didn't take away all the pain. Well, I just like to point out that from a Christian perspective, okay, sure, it didn't take away all the pain, but let's be realistic about this. The guy had an 8, now he's got a 2. And also, let's remember that in the scriptures, there are cases of people, for example, Paul in 2 Corinthians, asking for God to take away a particular thing, and he doesn't. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But when you stack up experiences like this one, and even just taking Mike's life, because I'm his friend, I know a couple of things about him. You've got Mike's life. You've got this example. You've also got in Mike's life supernatural things that may have happened when he was younger in his home where he grew up with a father who was very interested in that sort of thing. And then you also have an example that Mike has given us of extreme answered prayer, where he was a part of or aware of a situation where an atheist friend of his had seen God answer to a dollar amount something that was very extremely unlikely in order for a church to be in answer to an all-night prayer meeting or something. So when you stack up these things, any one of them might think, okay, well, maybe I could see that either way. It's when we stack these things up throughout the course of a Christian's life that we begin to grow much more confident, because it's not one thing or two things. It's many things throughout many years of living for the Lord Jesus Christ. Caleb, what do you think when you hear what Mike has to say?
Well, first, I guess the first thing I would say is I'm very happy for you, Mike. I'm obviously anyone who's in a lot of pain who's able to be relieved from that. It's always a great thing, and we should be happy regardless of what the cause may be in that. Look, obviously, someone who's looked into a lot of these, I'm very much open to miracles. It's been a fascination of mine for a long time, and I do believe in the supernatural. I do believe in God and Christianity. So I'm more than open to it. But at the same time, it's not my job to say whether or not I think God has or hasn't healed someone. I don't think I can prove that God didn't intervene in the case. And I say all of that to just sort of supplement to say that while I do, again, acknowledge that I'm happy for Mike, this would not, in my opinion, stack up to perhaps the level we would want in terms of a bona fide miracle. But it's also not something where it's like either it is a miracle or it isn't, right? I think you can have a scale of confidence. So for various reasons, I think that I don't doubt that Mike really does feel better and that he's improved. I wouldn't put it necessarily in my highest ranking of confidence that we couldn't rule out some kind of psychological explanations and stuff like that. But I would definitely want to hear a bit more of Mike's perspective in terms of I don't know, were you on any kinds of pain relievers? You said you didn't feel anything immediately when it was happening. Was there any sense of adrenaline rush, anticipation? I guess what was sort of the mindset behind all of that?
Well, I hadn't had any alcohol at dinner.
Okay.
Let's see, I'm not on any pain medications. I wasn't sleep deprived. I don't know what else you might want to ask.
Yeah, no, that's good. I just, all of those little details matter when you're sort of interviewing in those cases like that. So I don't know. It is one of those where pain is sort of a very hard metric to measure because a lot of it's subjective. You can't really do a blood test and verify, oh, they're in this much pain, right? So going from an 8 to a 2 is quite significant. But again, this was 2 weeks ago. Looks like it's persisted so far. Have to wait and see what happens. Hopefully, pray there's not a relapse, right? So all those
something happens. I don't,
Yeah. Right.
Why did it happen for only a few weeks? These are questions I just can't answer. It's just
Right.
I don't know the answer to those.
Yeah,
There's
and
just a,
Caleb, let me ask you if this is kind
yeah.
of synonymous with the way you look at something. Um, with let's take near death experiences for a moment. Now, I don't know what your feeling is about near death experiences, but I think that there are some cases that seem to be evidential cases, and some cases that may well have been a near death experience, but they're not evidential. That is, it may have happened, but I can't demonstrate that to somebody else. So when I'm looking at a near death case, a lot of Christians are interested in, well, what did they see in heaven and all those sorts of things. I'm not as interested at those things, at least initially. The thing I'm most interested in is, okay, did they report this fairly quickly after they were resuscitated? It's really nice if we have an unbelieving medical professional that documented this, and any evidential pieces, like they knew about something going on in the room that they shouldn't have known about or somewhere else, and I have like 5 criteria, and that is what it will take for me to use a near-death experience as an evidential chip in favor of the afterlife or the supernatural. And as I'm listening to you, it sounds like you're saying something similar. Like, I couldn't take Mike's case right now and go have a debate that this was a miracle or not, but it may have been a supernatural miracle on some level. We just can't use it evidentially that way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you already have enough cases that are well evidenced, as I think you would agree with near-death experiences, and I would agree with miracle claims, right? Then that builds up the background to where you could say, well, look, the fact that Mike might be healed by prayer, if you really do believe that there's evidence that prayer can work in these cases, yeah, there's nothing intrinsically unlikely about God healing Mike. I think that's perfectly plausible. But like, again, I think that this is one where I can't rule out comfortably other explanations, but it doesn't mean that I'm saying it didn't happen. It just means it's basically unfalsifiable, at least at this point, right? Where we're not really sure where
You
it's
might
at.
have recently read a Tony Robbins book and been positively thinking or something, right?
Yeah, for sure. So
Yeah.
so I agree, but you're absolutely right about criteria. I feel the same way about near-death experiences. I'm a little bit more skeptical of them, but I'm definitely open. And I think there's a couple that are very compelling. I know Gary Habermas, who's a friend of Mike Licona, obviously has done a lot of work in that area as well and knows more about those than I would. So there's quite a lot of good reasons, I think, to think that that's true. And I think it really builds our Christian framework when we have reasons to believe independently of the resurrection. And that sort of ties back into the truth where you can say, yeah, we can believe in miracles because we can use that as a category to say, well, yeah, there's weird stuff that happens today in a religious context that we can't explain. And so why not just say that the resurrection of Jesus fits into that category? And now the prior probability is not really all that low anymore.
Right. Mike, do you have anything you want to add about that experience before we move on to a different part of the conversation, let's say?
Yeah, let's see if I can articulate it. It came to mind, but in terms of positive thinking, the Tony Robbins, all of us who are believers, we've had experiences where we've prayed and we've had, pretty cool prayer requests answered. So much, so cool that it would appear that coincidence is very unlikely. Then there have been a lot of prayer requests we get answered, and it's like, I got the job. I applied for the job. I got it. Was that because God answered prayer? You just don't know. Maybe not. I had seen Lisa pray for another one of our board members. Nothing happened. Has done it a couple of times, and nothing has happened. Mm-hmm. So I can just say my state of mind, to the best of my recollection, 2 weeks ago when she was praying for me, it's like, this would be nice. I don't know if something is going to happen here. It'd be nice. It's worth a shot. I'm gonna just, I know God can do it. I believe he can do it. I hope he will. That's my frame of mind when that happened.
Yeah. I remember when I was working on my doctorate of ministry degree at Luther Rice Seminary, and it was a intensive on campus week where we were supposed to, write an expository sermon, preach it, do all that stuff right there and in front of your class. And we didn't get the kind of legendary older preaching professor that they had. He was sick, so they had a filling guy, and he was pretty good. But at some point he said, I've always wondered about these people in the charismatic community that think that God uses them specifically to heal, as that's like their ministry is to heal people. He said, if that were true, why don't they go into the hospitals and clear out all the hospitals? And I raised my hand, and I don't know if this affected my grade, but I said, I'm sympathetic to, a Southern Baptist way of seeing things, or a non-denominational, which is usually Southern Baptist way of seeing things. But I said, even though I'm not as familiar with that side of things and that manifestation, I said, the truth is I consider myself to be an Ephesians 4:11 evangelist. Now, when I go out and preach, why is it that not everyone becomes a Christian? Why is it that when Paul preached, not everyone became a Christian? It seems that there's more going on in terms of free will and what God wants to do, and he sees the big picture that we don't always see. So if a person, like your friend on your board, seems to be someone who God uses on occasion to heal someone, that it doesn't happen once doesn't count as a huge problem in my eyes. I don't think it's so much like a prophet sort of thing in the Old Testament, where if he gets one wrong, that's the deal, right? I think this is more of there's more variables involved. So that's kind of,
and keep in mind, Braxton, as well, even in Mark, I think it is, Mike would know this more than I would off the top of my head, but I believe there's a part where he goes to Nazareth and he's not even able to heal everyone because of their unbelief. Yeah. And even in Acts, where there's plenty of miracles, right? Like you see them raising people from the dead, like Tabitha. Paul raises someone from the dead who falls out of a building, but at the same time, James is executed by Herod, and they don't make any attempts, so far as we know, to raise him from the dead. So it's not like it was a constant, at any point they could just do it, right? So yeah, I think that, as you said, just because someone has the gift of teaching doesn't mean they can never give a bad sermon. And just because someone has the gift of healing,
amen.
Just because someone has the gift of healing doesn't mean they can never be unsuccessful, I think. But then it becomes a weird question where a pastor asked me one time, like, do you consider it a batting average? And that I thought that was a funny analogy, where it's like, oh, it's true. If you pray for 100 people and 10 of them are healed, that's probably higher than what most people could do. But, so I don't know what the proportion of healing to non-healing is for it to count as the gift of healing.
It's interesting, Caleb, because I had a guy on, I started another podcast, and actually I did it for a little while because Mike told me that he really liked it, where I was talking about supernatural stories that people had and that sort of thing. And one of the guys that I talked to and interviewed for that was a person who Craig Keener had interviewed and included his story in his book. And when so he had multiple evidential miracle type things. And he told me that there were many times where he prayed for someone that they would be healed, but the times that he felt some kind of special conviction to do it. And he said of those times, it's always been a healing. Now, obviously that's easy to say if you're a skeptic out there that could deny, well, yeah, you would say that. But for those of us who aren't skeptical just for the case of it, that I think that was interesting. But well, let's talk a little bit about this, about healings that you have been aware of, Caleb. Now, you gave a PowerPoint.
Braxton, before Caleb does that, could I just say two other things real quickly?
Absolutely, Mike.
Caleb brought up how in the Gospels that Jesus wasn't able to do miracles in Nazareth because of their unbelief. I agree with him. There's another case where Jesus goes to heal a blind man, and he says, well, how's that work? How is it now? And he says, well, I see men, they look like trees, right? So he's got to do it again. So that's kind of interesting. And, the 2 days after I was healed by my board member, I was in church and I wanted to share it. I shared it to a friend there. And he was kind of skeptical, and I said, well, look, and I popped down in the Asian squat, and he says, well, why doesn't she go into hospitals? And I said, I guess it doesn't work that way. Why didn't Jesus do that? And he didn't.
That's
right.
Right.
And I'll just point out it's funny about the stuff being left over, because you see with the resurrection too, Jesus still has the scars and the wounds on his hands. So like, even though he was healed, he still had the marks left over. And that's actually a common theme that you'll find in one of the last chapters of the book. I try to go over trends that you see within the data sets. And you'll notice this time and again, especially with some of the Catholic healings at Lourdes, which I've talked to Braxton about on another show before. One common thing you'll see is that people will be healed, but they'll have some kind of very minor sequelae left over, right? Like a benign thing. So if someone might have nerve damage and be in a wheelchair and they'll be healed and they can walk again, but when you do the x-rays, their spine is still severed. They still have the nerve severings, but they can function and they're like perfectly fine, and you wouldn't be able to tell. And so
That
it's
alone
like,
seems like highly evidential stuff right there.
yeah, right. Or they'll have like a scar left over from where the wound used to be or something like that, right? Or they'll have a slight shoulder that's still there. So I think the thing is that these almost like are souvenirs, right? They're leaving marks left over to sort of prove that they actually had the condition. Because, and I've seen it happen, you'll have someone who might be completely healed with nothing left over. And what's the first thing people say? Oh, well, it was a misdiagnosis. They never had it to begin with. Because now look, the scan shows that that the cancer's there. So clearly we made a mistake the first time, right? But so like, no, if it's still there, then you can say, well, it's still there, but it's not harming you anymore. I can't explain why. So I think that to me is the most sense, where it's like you're healed enough to where it's not disharming you, but you're at the same time, it's enough to where it's leaving us something left over where people can't just automatically just write it off, you know?
You know, the preacher in me, the loudmouth, leather-lunged, red-faced Baptist preacher in me wants to say, well, look, it may well be that God left Mike with that little 2 pain instead of the 8 pain, because now it's really not a big inconvenience for Mike, but he'll always remember this pain used to be a lot worse. You know, I could say something like that, but I don't know. I'm not going to thump the pulpit anymore and say, thus saith the Lord, if I don't know what the Lord thus saith.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But you gave us a PowerPoint here with, I think, some things we could cover here, Caleb. So why don't you walk us through this?
Yeah. So this is just the general criteria that I use. And I didn't invent this. This is adapted from what the Catholic Church typically uses. I'm not Catholic myself, but I think in general, it's pretty good criteria. I've added a few of my own on here, but generally for the most evidential cases, again, I'm not saying that everyone has to have this, but the most compelling cases, I think you'd want these 10 criteria, right? So you'd want something that's medically documented. That's pretty straightforward. You want an organic disease, which means it's not purely psychosomatic. You can show, here's where the bone deterioration is, here's where the tumor is, here's where the nerve damage is, whatever it is. Progressive. This one's pretty important too. This shows that the disease was getting worse over time. It wasn't.
Mike's definitely not progressive.
Yeah. The disease was progressive, not the person being healed, although that could count too. But yeah. So the disease was getting worse over time, right? Because if the person got a little bit better before they were prayed for, you could say maybe that was some natural thing in the body that was already improving prior, right? But if they were only getting worse prior, then it's less likely. It's a very serious disease. So we're not talking about, again, something that's kind of a minor inconvenience where, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's something that's like truly either life-threatening or at least severely disabling. The person needs to be in a wheelchair. They have to have a cane because they're blind. Their life is in danger, something like that. Something very, very serious, which is also less likely to go in its own. Then we get to the cure. It needs to be religiously correlated. Most common example being prayer, right? But it could also count if they go to a religious shrine, a church service, something, it's sort of a when you see it kind of thing. Unprecedented. This is one of the tougher ones, I think. But when I say unprecedented, I mean that it shouldn't be something that you can find in the literature very easily, where you can look this up and see that there are other examples of people getting better without prayer, right? Because if this is truly a sign from God that's standing outside of what nature normally does, you wouldn't expect it to be normal, right? Like if Jesus is going to walk on water, that's impressive because people normally don't walk on water. And if we had other examples of people walking on water in secular context, it would be less impressive. So that's one thing. Permanent, pretty self-explanatory. We don't want it to relapse. Instantaneous, another thing you want, where it doesn't happen where they were prayed for and then 5 days later they feel a bit better. It's like at that moment or right after that, within a few minutes, because the body, as you know, is made up of billions of cells that work together and they reproduce at a certain rate. So you can have like a wound or a cut close over time, but you can't have it happen in a few minutes because of the rate of cell growth. It would just be biologically impossible. So an instantaneous cure, a complete cure. This one, again, with sort of Mike's one, it's a little bit not clear to me because complete is like having no more disability, right? So like Mike said, it's at a 2 now, which is definitely statistically significant and impressive. But like, is it complete cure? It's hard to tell, right? And then spontaneous, which means that it wasn't attributed to any kind of medicine or like medical intervention. So they weren't taking a medication right before that could have led to it getting better or a surgery or something like that. So it seems like to me that these are pretty objective, fair criteria that don't seem to be religiously gerrymandered, right? Like we can all agree, like, yeah, it seems like these are pretty fair standards, I would think, in terms of saying what would and wouldn't be compelling. So I'd say Mike checks off a couple of those boxes, but there's not nearly enough there for me to be super confident. But again, I'm not saying that someone who doesn't have these isn't cured or wasn't given a miracle. I'm just saying that our confidence in it wouldn't be as high.
That makes sense.
So yeah, so this is just one example I have. Sort of similar to a pain one, but to a bigger degree. So this is Patricia Zimba. This happened back in the early to mid 90s. She was 14 when this occurred. So right before Christmas, around December 24th, 23rd of 1993, she was on her family's farm. They had a horse. She falls off the horse and injures her leg. At first, nothing too bad, just slight soreness. She wakes up the next day on Christmas Day, and that's the bottom right picture on the couch. And she mostly stays on the couch because her leg is very sore. She can't really move very well. That wears off within a few days, but then early January, on January 3rd, she's taking a bath and she feels this extreme wrath of pain just go through her body, and she basically becomes almost paralyzed and can't get out of the bath by herself. So she's taken to the hospital, and after a long series of tests, they basically decide that this is what they would call RSD, which is reflex sympathetic dystrophy. Today it's called CRPS. It's slightly different, but basically the same thing, right? So if you go to the next slide on there, I think I have that for what that is. Yeah. So CRPS is one of the most painful diseases you could possibly get, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look on this is the McGill like pain index. So you can see like a fracture is at about a 15 level of pain. Cancer is about a 25. Childbirth, unprepared childbirth are in the upper 30s. CRPS is about in the mid 40s. So this is like 50s, the worst pain imaginable. She was at probably about a 45. So you can imagine how unbearable that would be. So it causes your body to flare up. Like this is a picture just of a random patient with this, where you can see the inflammation and the discoloration on the leg. This is what was happening to Trisha. Her leg was going in and out. It was in extreme pain. So they give her all of these pain medications. She's on so much morphine. It does absolutely nothing to help her situation. They basically give her the highest legal amount of morphine that they can without overdosing her. And if they did any more, it literally would have killed her. So she's hospitalized for several weeks at this point, and doctors have tried to do everything they can in their power. And her doctors were not confident. In fact, one of her parents kept praying for Trisha, saying that they believed God was going to do a miracle. And the doctor replied, no, I don't think that's going to happen in this case. At best, we could expect maybe a gradual healing with rehabilitation, but even then, this is not certain, right? So at this point, Trisha, you can go to the next slide, is in immense pain. That's an actual photo of her on the left there, writhing in her hospital bed. They couldn't even put a blanket properly on the leg because it was that painful. So even like the slightest pressure on it would be almost unbearable. So you can imagine how miserable this would be in this time, and nothing the doctors could do at this point would hurt. On her to the right is some of the inflammation you can see from the abdominal region and lower in that area. So this is not a disease that is really curable. Sometimes it can be treated to improve a little bit better over time, but at this point, there wasn't really much that our physicians could do. And severe forms of this disease, which at this point Trisha had, have usually pretty negative prognoses. On the best end, you could hope for maybe a gradual rehabilitation. On the worst end, people who have this sometimes will have to be institutionalized because they literally like go crazy from how much pain they're in. Other times they will kill themselves just to get out of it. And sometimes they'll actually have the body part that's in pain amputated. So that was the prognosis that Trisha's parents were told, is that realistically, there's a good chance she either might have to be institutionalized or that she could kill herself, or that we're going to have to amputate something. So you can imagine they're extremely desperate at this point. But on, I think it was March 11th, the night of March 11th, they pray for her one more time. Trisha had at this point a surgery scheduled that had not happened yet, where they were going to, as a last resort, try to implement a pump into her spine to pump morphine in. Which is a pretty drastic procedure, but it's only for, extreme cases as this one, as a last resort. But before this happens on March 11th, her family prays for her one more time and they leave for the night. About 3 o'clock that morning, Trisha wakes up, and Trisha at this point was like half asleep. She wakes up and she's just praying to God for, not even for healing per se, but just for comfort, right? Just emotional comfort. And as she's doing this, she starts to feel a feeling from the top of her head, and it slowly comes down her body, is how she describes it. And eventually it goes to her leg and leaves. And at that point, all the pain's gone from her body. And so she's laying there like, what just happened? And then she hears a voice. No one else is in the bed, the hospital room with her. And the voice says, like, get up, very, very faintly. And she's like processing this. It's like, what's happening? Did I hear that? And then a little bit louder, she hears a voice say, get up. And so she lifts herself up and walks in the hospital. If you see the last slide on there, this is like a recreation of it, but she's walking through the hospital. This is 3 a.m. Her nurse sees her and is like, oh my gosh, Trisha, what are you doing out of bed? And Trisha tells her that she's not in pain anymore. So they call her parents. At this point, they get there at about 4 a.m. in the morning, and they're rejoiced and overjoyed to see her walking without pain. Take in mind, she hadn't walked in 2 months up to this point. She had been completely hospitalized. So she had muscle atrophy, obviously a paraplegic, and yet at this point was completely functional. Media reported on this. It was reported in several television shows, newspapers, stuff like that. When they interviewed her doctors who testified to this, I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but they were basically astounded to say, yeah, this is the worst case of this condition I've ever seen. I didn't think it was going to get better. There was nothing we could do. And I've never heard of a case in literature where RSD just like that overnight instantaneously went away completely and permanently. So it's pretty remarkable. Again, this is a disease that can go away gradually, but it's not something that you would have instantaneously go away, especially when it's that severe. Usually the ones that go away gradually are like more mild forms. But when someone's hospitalized at that point and it's completely resistant to treatment, the prognosis is very bad. So I haven't been able to find anything in the literature that's comparable to this in this context. Actually, you know what else is funny is the few cases I found of this disease that also went away instantaneously were also in religious contexts where other people were prayed for this disease. Yeah. So the only cases I could find where it's like, oh, here's a rapid removal from RSD were cases where people went to like a faith healing conference or something were prayed for. So that to me is pretty remarkable. So we can. So
does this match all of your? So this matches all of the stuff on the criteria.
Yeah, I would say almost all of them that I can think of. Yeah, I don't think there's one that this would not check out. I mean, there's a couple you could say maybe it's questionable, but overall, like, yeah, she. I think the most recent follow-up with her was like 5 to 7 years out after the cure out of it. So I don't know where she's at today if she's still in good health. But 5 to 7 years with no relapse with this is still pretty remarkable. So I have no idea if it came back or not. But from every evidence that I've seen, at least from what we have documented, it didn't from that time period at least.
Well, now, before I get what, Mike might have something to say, I don't know, but I wanted to remind everyone that we actually did a video. We've done a couple before, but we did a video with Caleb sometime back, a couple of years ago, maybe. And he actually presented evidence that meets the criteria for a possibility of a person, like it was a person who, am I getting this right? Like their spine was almost severed from their head.
Mm-hmm.
It was a church had been burned or something. And this guy, they found him later and it had there was a real supernatural healing there with medical, like you had images of x-rays, I think, or something. And so whatever it was, maybe I'm overselling it, but go back and check that out.
Yeah. I mean, I won't repeat what you said. That was pretty good. But yeah, so this is just one of many cases. And again, I just try to mix these up and not repeat them when I go on different shows. So many ones like this. Keener does mention this one briefly in his new book on miracles, Miracles Today. But I wanted to go a bit more into like the documentation, like the criteria aspect of it. So I don't know if Mike has any thoughts on that, but that would be one example of like a really, profound healing that I think is compelling.
Can you get this disease, Mike, and then be healed of that?
No, you can do another show. Woo! You first, man. You first.
Yeah. Well, I want everyone to know that after this, we're going back to doing a extra episode for supporters as channel members and patrons. If you're a channel member, there's a link in a post that is just available for channel members to see, and also on Patreon for paid members. The extra episode with Caleb's going to be there right after this one. It's going to go live at 3:10 Central Standard Time. But for now, Mike, let's go back to you for just a second, and if you don't mind, I'd like to get both of you guys to maybe comment on this. So both of you all have talked about this, I think, quite a bit. So it should be an area where we can all kind of talk about this. So the resurrection of Jesus, the most important, the historical centerpiece of the Christian faith is the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, Mike, you have for many, many years debated the biggest names on the other side of the aisle, agnostics, atheists, whatever, who bring challenges to the historicity of the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And of course, we've been talking here with Caleb about miracles and healings, but there's a lot of people who come to this and say, well, look, guys, even with all that criteria, you can't ever conclude a miracle, because a miracle by definition, it's miraculous. It's the least likely thing to occur. So even if we want to talk about people today and let them feel good that there was something ooey gooey and supernatural and God loves them and all that, when we go back to the resurrection of Jesus, that's supposed to be a miracle, that Jesus was raised by God from the dead. And that's so far in the past. And it's so unlikely, by the admission of even religious people, in the sense that these miracles don't just happen left, right, and center, and we just all know it's a part of reality. So how can we be confident? How can we feel intellectually justified in claiming that that it was a miracle that Jesus was raised from the dead? Either one of you. Maybe Mike first.
Well, in answer to the first thing that you said, a miracle by its definition is the least probable explanation. I don't know why that needs to be part of the definition. And I guess it just depends. I mean, how are you going to actually define a miracle? When you say it's the least probable explanation, does that mean anytime something natural comes up, like you got a full flush playing cards or something, that that might be the least probable explanation, or the least probable thing to occur? But is it a miracle?
Right.
Probably not. So what I would say to that is let's unpack that. Least probable in reference to what? So if you're going to look at things by natural cause, and let's say the resurrection of Jesus, I think we'd all agree that Jesus coming back to life after being crucified by natural causes, that would be the least probable explanation. But if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then that becomes the most probable explanation, right? So least probable in reference to what? It seems that you have to throw in your worldview there, in your atheistic worldview, for it to be the least probable explanation. Now, I like Caleb's criteria. The way I have looked at things to identify something historically is to have two criteria. Number one, it has to be extremely unlikely by natural causes. And number two, it occurs in a context charged with religious significance. So, if an example I typically give is, if you have a man who's born blind, let's say he's 50 years old, and on some afternoon he's having lunch with his wife in their house, and for some unknown reason, all of a sudden at noon he gets his eyesight. Goes to the doctor. Why do I have my eyesight for the first time in my life? I have no reason. I have no medical explanation. Was that a miracle? He's an atheist. He's never prayed for his eyesight. I see no reason to think that that's a miracle. But let's say at noon, the doorbell rings and the wife goes and opens it up and says, "I'm the pastor so-and-so from the First Baptist Church down there on the corner. And, I was just with my staff and we were praying at lunchtime. And we all had the sense of feeling that I needed to come down here and sing the first stanza of Amazing Grace to you. And I know it sounds crazy, but can I do it?" Yeah, I suppose. And so he sings it. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see." Hey, thanks a lot. Just want to let you know you're welcome at our church anytime, and have a great day. And closes the door. And as the wife comes into the room, her husband has tears in his eyes, and he's saying, "For the first time I can see in my life, my eyes were opened when the pastor said was blind, but now I see." Well, is that a miracle? I would contend it is. What's the difference? Well, it's extremely unlikely to have occurred by natural causes, just like the first scenario. But the difference is this occurred in a context charged with religious significance. And I think that makes the difference there. The resurrection of Jesus did not occur outside of such a context. It occurred in the context where he claimed to be chosen by God to usher in his kingdom. He claimed to be God's uniquely divine son. He performed deeds that astonished crowds and that his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. He predicted his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. I think that provides a significant context in which we might expect a God to act. And so and I'm not presupposing the reliability of those accounts, that he believed he was chosen by God to usher in his kingdom. He claimed to be the Son of God, things like that. I think we can establish those things historically. So that's the context in which Jesus' death and resurrection appear.
Yeah, so it's really unlikely, and like it's almost impossible by natural explanations, or and it's in a religiously informed context, like the resurrection was. Yeah, that's really helpful. So, Caleb, when you listen to this, when you come back on this, what do you think? Do you think when we're doing history, we have to change the criteria a bit? I mean, we're not going to have medical reports for things before a few decades back.
Sure. Yeah. So I should have clarified those criteria are specifically for healing reports, right? And that way, and that's primarily what I'm focused on, just because I think those are the best documented. But of course, you have to change your criteria depending on what you're looking at. I would ask though, Mike, because I think that those are really interesting points. Out of curiosity, within your criteria, suppose that both of those incidents happened, right? Suppose that we had a case where the blind guy just got better sipping tea on his porch, and we had a comparable case where the man was healed of the same condition after Amazing Grace, right? If one was a skeptic and we had both examples, could one say, well, look, the fact that we know that in this first case, he got better without prayer, right? Divine intervention, so far as we know, that indicates that there's some mechanism that maybe we don't understand that can allow this to happen, right? So the fact that now we can say, well, so we can appeal to say whatever that explanation is, we can appeal to that to say maybe that applies in the second case, right? Would you be concerned about that if there were comparable cases that were secular, where that we also didn't know the explanation of, right? Because I'm wanting to not, do the whole God of the gaps thing, which I know is a very common thing that people try to pull, right? And I agree, it's not just we're not just saying we don't know, therefore God, and that's not what you were doing either. We're saying given the context, that's what it would be. But I think this is where it gets really tricky sometimes, right? Because you can have things that happen in a religious context that are inexplicable, but the way that they happen, it's like, maybe it could have been something, right? And something as ubiquitous as prayer, which is very common in terms of people praying for recovery when it's a serious condition. You could argue, sometimes very unlikely things happen lining up with prayer because prayer is not very uncommon. So statistically, it's inevitable eventually, right? So I'm curious, do you think that it has to be unparalleled for it to count, or are you still okay with counting it, even if there were other examples that we didn't know why it happened in a secular context?
I think that's a really good question you ask. I don't know the answer to that, Caleb. I think you'd have to step back and have less confidence in it, as you'd say. I tried to, when I picked that hypothetical scenario, I tried to pick one that would seem, that probably don't have a precedent like that within natural reports. So maybe there are. If there are, then yeah, that'd be something we'd have to consider. I do think, though, maybe there's a scale. I mean, what about if he got a sight? Let's say you've got a parallel account where no prayer, and the guy was an atheist and he gets a sight at a certain time for some unknown reason. But let's suppose in the case that the guy did get his sight, he did it at the very moment the pastor sang, was blind, but now I see. Right. I still think that we'd probably be justified in believing that was a miracle, just because of the amazing coincidence or correspondence with being in such a context. What do you think?
I think that's a good point, right? It's kind of like if you were playing poker and someone's like, I prophesy that the next one you'll immediately get a royal flush, and then they do, right? Like, I mean, you could say maybe they cheated or dealt the deck or something like that, but supposing that you could prove they didn't do that, that was remarkable, because even though it's not impossible that could happen, it's still very unlikely.
It reminds me, I didn't mean to break your flow there, Caleb, but it kind of reminds me of Mike's friend, Bill Dembski. And, he talks about specified complexity when he's talking about fine tuning and things. And, it's kind of what we're talking about here. So when someone wins the Powerball, okay, it's ridiculously unlikely that any particular, epistemically unlikely, like from our perspective, it's ridiculously unlikely that any particular person will win the Powerball, but but we can be confident that someone will win, given enough Powerballs, right? That it is kind of set up for this. And so there's high numbers. But on the other hand, so like he uses the cards just like you did. So he's like saying any arrangement of cards is equally unlikely in terms of just probabilities or whatever. But the fact that you have the, what is it, the royal flush or the full house? I never know. I'm not a poker player, but whatever the perfect hand is to win the game, like if it's the specified complexity of not just having ridiculously unlikely, but it conforming to the pattern that was exactly what you needed in the context of the game. So when I hear, like, it almost becomes a counterbalancing probability, because okay, maybe it's really unlikely that this resolves naturally, but occasionally this particular illness does resolve naturally. And let's say it resolves fairly quickly. But the fact that it happened right after the prayer, like you guys were just discussing, that's a whole different, seems like to me like a different probability measure that counterbalances the other one and maybe surpasses it. So it seems like there's a lot to discuss here, and maybe even as I'm listening to you, more than I knew in the probability metric.
Yeah, I think I think the specified is a good point as well. And I know Mike, I think, has given this example before to say, like, suppose that you have the moon and an asteroid hits it, and the way that the craters go spells out Jesus is Lord, right? Now you could say, well, we know meteorites hit moons and make craters sometimes. So like theoretically you could organize it to where it could make a shape that resembles Jesus as Lord, right? But nonetheless, no one would take that seriously, because it would be so
I know someone who would. And that's possibly Matt Dillahunty, who debated Mike. And that's
there you go. Yeah, they would say that we couldn't do that. But like, again, this is where it comes down, I think, to like making predictions, right? So this is what natural theology has been big at in the past, I don't know, 50, 60 years, with people like Bill Craig and Richard Swinburne and others who talk about, like, take theism as a hypothesis, right? If God were to do a miracle, what would you expect it to be, right? Well, you'd expect it to be in a religious context, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't know what the purpose of it was. It would just be arbitrary. And you'd expect it to be something that stood out from nature, because if it didn't, then you wouldn't recognize it as a miracle. So I think those are the two main things, right? So you could say, well, maybe there's a natural condition, a natural law that works specifically with prayer to make unlikely things happen. But that's so ad hoc and unnatural. There's no reason why we would predict such a law to happen only when it's being, when prayer is invoked, right? So I would think that if you couldn't replicate that and it only happened in a religious context, that would be very good reasons to think that this is better under the theistic hypothesis, that God is answering a prayer, right? It's almost like you're making a prediction. You're saying, God, if you're there, I'm asking you to do this. The thing happens. It's very unlikely it would have happened otherwise. So that's evidence of, literally God doing something in real time, I would think. So that's sort of how I consider it.
And I'm going to kick it back to you guys to just kind of close out here as we kind of wrap up. But I want to say real quick, I want to remind people of what I said toward the beginning, which is, look, the truth is what we have is an example of an event that happened in someone's life. And taking Mike, in Mike's life, he had this thing happen that in his worldview seems consistent with prayer. It seems unlikely that it would happen like this, but also in your own life. Well, for Christians, we live decades as Christians, hopefully, and we see a number of things that are very confirmatory to us about our faith. And it's kind of like we often treat things like a particular event as either a slam dunk in favor of our religion or the truth of Christianity, or not, or it's just a thing that happens, just irrelevant. It's just a thing that happens in the world. It could be explained naturally. But the truth is, it's more like a mosaic. It's more like we have all these little pieces throughout our Christian life that when you put them all together, they build a beautiful picture of, say, Jesus or something. We have all of these in our life, and we put them all together, and it's really hard for us, after having lived for very many years as a Christian, to deny some of these pieces and what they seem to point to, particularly laid on top of each other in that way. And that's how people in apologetics who practice cumulative case apologetics as an approach, that's how they present evidence is, hey, instead of giving you some big slam dunk argument that proves everything, it's a bunch of little things that, to me, not only make it reasonable, but mount up to a very good case in favor of Christian theism. So when I hear about people having healings in church or something, I don't always know all the details about that, but I know in my life, I've seen a lot of things that are consistent with God answers prayers. I realize that the criticism is, well, you could be counting only the hits and not the misses. But I'm kind of like Mike. I'm kind of a person who is a second guesser, and I look at what's happened from all angles. So I notice when it feels like something didn't happen, but I've had enough examples of it happening that now at this point in my life, I'm just much more confident in the Christian faith, even through those things that I can't prove to anybody else, but just what I've seen through my eyes. To you guys, as we close this down, is there anything you'd like to say that you feel like didn't get said or you'd like to reaffirm? Mike?
You know, it's been, you mentioned something, and I think you did it before as well, but, or maybe Caleb did, about the batting average. And I don't know how that, I don't know how you would quantify things. I think that had I prayed 100 times and nothing happened, let's say I'd prayed about my knee 100 times. I don't even know that I prayed about my knee ever, about that. But let's
Whose
suppose
fault
I
is
prayed
that, Mike?
What's that?
Whose fault is that?
Well, yeah, mine. But let's suppose I prayed 100 times for the healing, just in my own, in my own time with the Lord, and nothing happened. And then all of a sudden she prayed, laid her hand on my knee, prayed, and boom, it's feeling better. I mean, I can understand why a skeptic wouldn't look at that as evidence, compelling evidence. They might look at it as curious. But I look at it because of the context and say, yeah, that's good enough for me. I think God did something there. Now, again, if my knee goes back to the way it was, I still might think God did something. I don't know why he allowed it to go back. Anyway, I'm going to give him glory for it, for what he did it, just because I do believe that he did something there. I don't expect others to believe it. I'm not sure exactly what happened. So I agree with Caleb's assessment that, there are some things that we can have greater confidence. This is not one of those that a miracle happened. I'm all for that. I understand that entirely.
Yeah. Go, Caleb. I was just going to say, I love this because I love that atheists who are watching this are going to see both something that does cause you to raise eyebrows, then some stories from Caleb that hit all his criteria, and they're seeing that yeah, we're being honest about it. And Caleb's sitting here next to a kind of a giant in the Christian thought community, and yet he's being honest about his criteria, and I love that. So Caleb, what do you have to say before we go?
Yeah, I'm absolutely honored. I'll just say two quick things. First, I absolutely agree with Mike on the averages thing as well. We have to be very careful. I don't think we want to be overly presumptive and say everything's a miracle, because then we become credulous, but we also don't want to be closed-minded, right? And in talking to people like this too, people get very emotional, right? Because it's great as to talk about the miracle stories. I'm also cognizant that there's plenty of people who aren't healed, and I don't want to do it as if it's like God is playing favorites and rubbing anyone's faces, right? I mean, I think even the past 30 days in this country have just been so rough, with so many tragedies and horrible things happening. So I don't want to act for a minute as if like God answers every prayer. There's plenty of people praying for things who didn't get helped. So I'm very sympathetic to that as well. But I don't think that that's, confirmatory that prayer doesn't work. It just means that God sometimes answers prayers. And last thing I'll say too, I think with the resurrection, as we tie this to with Mike's work on that, which is great. The reason why I think I was so inspired to do this project is because although I think the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is adequate, I think it's consistent. I think there's enough ambiguity in history itself to where, there can always be that layer of doubt. So when you look at Acts and you look at the New Testament, yes, it was the preaching of the resurrection that converted people, but the apostles were also doing signs and wonders and miracles, and Christians were doing this for the several first centuries of the church. So I don't think that our faith is just in a resurrected Christ. I think it's in a Christ who's still alive and is still doing things in the world today. It wasn't just an event of the past. It's something that has effects today. So I would just keep that in mind and say that I think that these sort of live miracles are further evidence that Jesus is still alive and not just a single event that happened, thousands of years ago.
Beautifully put, men. And stay right there, you guys. I want to say something to the audience, guys. Right after this is done, right after we close this out, well, right after, we'll take a 10-minute break. Now it's an 8-minute break, and come back for the Patreon and member only live stream. And so I hope that you'll find that in the channel members section. And Caleb is going to share with us another miracle story. And so we definitely want to get to that. Thank you guys for being on today. Thank you all for showing up, and I'll see you all next time on Trinity Radio.